Delicate Subject. Chapter 46. Jane. There had been a moment over Alchera, with her still inside the Normandy, but with her fallen apart, where Jane had seen Joker clearly inside the escape pod. Jane had felt a profound and distinctly emotionally flavored slide from purpose to panic. She'd felt the satisfaction of getting Joker off the CIC. Despite Joker's expressed and repressed guilt for her death, she did not blame him for a moment for his decision to stay with his beloved ship. She was Joker's ship as much as she belonged to Jane, if not more his, more intimately his in many ways. She felt that same purpose and panic right now, in the dark. A longer interval of time to let it breed and build. She had had a purpose, to save Tuchanka, and that was becoming more and more assured. But her partial release from the medbay was like having the escape pod in view, but inaccessible, imminently more and more distant. She'd chosen Joker over her own life because to try to save both lives would have likely cost both lives. She had saved Tuchanka, but not herself. She had experienced the ominous and inevitable blast away from her disintegrating ship, the severing of her oxygen, the slow and inexorable descent, which she had missed for the most part, having choked to death on nothing. That was how this felt. She was choking on nothing. The oxygen that was her command was severed. Not as it had been after she'd been abducted. Then she could barely breathe at all, and paced breaths were all she could manage. Now she felt the overwhelming, racing need to gulp down breaths in the thin, spare atmosphere, in her opinion, unable to sustain life. There was just enough oxygen to panic. It partly hinged on Garrus being a terrible liar. Okay, not a terrible liar in the absolute sense. His lies had saved her before, and she remembered his pistol at a Krogan head. To clarify, Garrus had a terrible time lying to Jane. Jane could parse Garrus. She broke his misery down into packets of information, watched and listened to him for the last several days. She was now better able to see him and hear him. His subvocals needed no tutorial. It was as though her mind had barely heard it before, but had categorized every possibility and analyzed him. She had a ready-made and newly revealed reference library of his expressions, and his emotions were as clear as Thane's stripes. He was miserable, terrified, guilty, enraged, and suppressing all expression of those things. Was she going to be removed permanently from command? Karen had insisted that Jane rest herself entirely, refused to answer questions about future health goals. Jane was given no directive except to rest, no goal to reach except later. Jane didn't feel that her brain had been adversely affected, but how would she know? Weren't there any number of disorders that included in their symptom list the lack of awareness of the disorder itself? Despite the good news from Eurydice and the likelihood that the genophage would be cured, which was, in fact, a miracle, Garrus was badly contained chaos. Thane was a blank slate, subtly supporting Garrus and helping him stay somewhat contained, a circumstance that told its own tale. Karen was restricting Jane's data stream and communication enough to involve Edie and David, both of whom had mournfully told her that she was on strict medical suspension and she had no access to certain material. Since when was even a copy of a random extranet broadcast like Westerland News restricted material? Jane had methodically tested sources and methods of gathering information, in theory arousing no suspicion with each individual request, though if someone was monitoring everything she did, it would show a pattern of distinct probing. Command dispatches restricted. Fair, because she was not in command and should be resting. She'd accepted both Edie's and David's apologies after making separate requests to both of them on different topics, making it seem that she was only slightly forgetful about her change in status, apologizing to them with a light laugh about hard-to-break habits. Many of her own personal messages were blacked out based on Edie and David's judgment under Karen's directive. Unable to determine if this was fair, but certainly radical, creating a vacuum of concern like the empty tank on her back as she spiraled toward Alchera. She had made a query for general news made from Thane's terminal under a generic keystroke ID and not her vocal authorization. Denied. That had been the final test she had devised. The result meant that Edie and David were monitoring her requests, her location, and her interests. So, everyone was in on it. They would all know that she was looking. Cold calculation flooded her mind. Several theoretical scenarios to consider. The crew was indoctrinated. Unlikely. Possible. Consider a 7% possibility. She was indoctrinated or had sustained a complication of long-term indoctrination, maybe developing resistance to an inhibitor or new growth. Possible. Nothing to do but monitor her internal landscape. Fortunately or unfortunately, she knew exactly what indoctrination would do to her brain. Low likelihood. Assume 5%. No reason they could not tell her. It was possible she would not recover from her surgery or that full recovery was in doubt. She would have to trust to Karen's expertise. Karen would not tell her. Jane had done as much curious and casual probing as she could. Karen only admonished her to rest and wait. At least Jane was under the best care possible, and Jane would not allow paranoia to interfere with her care. She just wanted to know why. Consider 40% possible with current restriction of information. Unless Eurydice had been indoctrinated, then she was next. Then she was now with a week already under. Symptoms likely within another week. Inevitable unless she made a break for it at the first opportunity presented. Consider 3% possibility. Consider Morden and Miranda might have made it a great deal more insidious and effective. In which case, she could hope for 7 seconds. She'd already been indoctrinated on most subjects. It would close like a bear trap in on her. There was nothing she could do about it unless she decided, right now, to hijack a shuttle and go to Omega. Right now. She required more proof than what was available. It was terrifying, but not any more likely. Watch and wait. The reason the possibility was so low was that if she were indoctrinated, they could just wait and wouldn't need to restrict her news. They could have kept her under sedation entirely, keep her strapped down until it was done. They would have known they would have to do that for their best chance at success. Yes, they could have kept her down for a year. Maybe a lot had happened. Maybe this feeling of lack of oxygen was due to multiple tries of indoctrination. But again, paranoid fantasies should not run out of control. Counterproductive. The solution is either to flee the Normandy now, which you will not do on flimsy evidence, or wait, which it seems will be forced upon you either way. So wait it is. No action or plan required. Maybe see if shuttle controls will respond to you. No. Wait. Consider that something in the news would put her recovery at risk. That was most likely based on current setup. Consider 70% possibility of explanation of the behavior of the combination of Garrus, Thane, Karen, Edie, and David. Denial of information had been apologetic, not grudging or angry, and that she was being watched so effectively. Bump that up to an 80% possibility. So, what was in the news? What could not wait until she had healed, but had to wait until she had healed? What would make her put her recovery at risk by hearing that news? Why was she drawn back to the idea that there was not enough oxygen to sustain life? Consider new possibilities. The Citadel Council had turned entirely against her. Nobody would be surprised by that. Unlikely to result in news blackout, considering Jane had a reasonable image of the Council's unreasonableness. Negligible impact on her actions. Garrus could simply inform her that the Citadel was not a possible port, and she'd happily accept that. She was headed that way, if not there already. Garrus's mother was dead. Shocking and horrible, but not something to put her recovery at risk. She could accompany Garrus to her service. That would account for Garrus being a wreck, but not for the news blackout from Westerland. Mourning would be a distraction from command, and likely welcome for her to take some personal time. Terrible to see it that way, but true. So, no level of personal injury or personal involvement. The colony at Mojave was likely safe. Yalis had taken over the worlds. Also not a surprise. Might be a benefit. That detour into fancy made a flash of insights shuffle the necessary conditions and motivations. What would make her do something right now, despite her injuries and recovery time? What could happen that everyone knew would set her off irrevocably? What if life is in fact not able to be sustained, but it's not about your life, or your oxygen, or even your command or recovery? What word is synonymous with Shepard? Shepard? In fact, what's an anagram of Shepard for this exact situation? Reaped. Shh. Reapers. She'd be willing to bet. 95% chance. Reaper attack, full scale. 5% some unpredictable bullshit. So, let's go with the majority. Garrus wanted to tell her. That was what the packets of parsed, miserable Turian data meant. Thane would not let him. Karen was the excuse, and a good one, admittedly. And Jane had left Garrus with no directives. Stop the Reapers isn't a game plan, Jane. Cold intensified, but calm descended. She needed to think. Right now she was staring at a wall in her quarters, and she needed to get even her potential facial expressions under control until she thought her way through this. She was creeping toward rage, and she could not do that. She was being watched. Thane and Garrus were nearly always with her, distracting and charming and perfectly understandable. And she wanted to kill them both. For a moment, she wanted to flare like a supernova and take everything with her. She carefully stood, keeping her face thoughtful, blank. And she stepped into the simulation pod. She no longer trusted to the privacy settings. She would have no better access to information in here than she would out there. But she would and could have darkness and the proprioceptive sense of a natural arm. So she sat in the dark, where she could not be read, where she could not be analyzed, and where she could hide. Don't kill your bondmate. Don't kill your wristbound. Breathe. She sat still in the dark and let the Russian rage and helplessness course through her veins and her thoughts, the tidal wave and aftershocks, chaotic. She tried to think over the raw. 2 tracks of thought, Shepard. Personal and command. Your bondmate is in command, and your wristbound is a pawn Aoife master. They are not trying to harm you. It is the reverse. They wish to protect you. What about trust? Open fists? This isn't about trust. It isn't just their fists. Garrus's fist must close on command, and you can't grasp it, or there is no such thing as being a team. You're not good at team, Jane. You know it. They know it. Tuchanka was a success, but it had a terrifying risk scale, and they want you out of that sphere of action until they're sure your brain is all there. If it was ever all there. You have to accept the consequences of losing your arm. You have to accept that if you want the eyesight you're avoiding by being in the dark, it comes at a price. You could have gotten them all killed, or worse, so many times. They'll follow you again. When you actually have 2 fists, and not one. Right now, you can barely carry a gun, much less shoot one. I want to fucking kill them both. But all I'm gonna do is maybe drive my remaining nails deeper into the skin of my palm and hide. I need to let them keep their secret. I can hide behind knowing and watching. I won't be the only one known and watched. We can all have some time to heal. This is already killing them. You don't need to bother finishing them off. Look, just suspicious enough, not too suspicious. Accept your rehab the way you did after your abduction. Here's the really tough question that has nothing to do with their fears of your insane but potentially effective actions. Part of your rage is helplessness. If you had the Normandy right now, this moment, and it was true, you were at 100%, and Garrus and Thane were right behind you. Would you know what to do? Could you save all those lives now losing their oxygen? No. They think you do. They think you can. I don't. I don't know yet if I can. Then maybe you should by the time command is back in your control. Consider helplessness for now, but take this time to think. Low-tech thinking. No more information than you already have, but be prepared for it. Do not be surprised by it. Have an order to give by then, or a direction to take. They feel helpless and guilty, just like you do. She wanted to hide, could not reveal what she thought or knew because what if she was wrong? What if her instincts and intuition were fucked? She couldn't deny she'd taken a distinctly paranoid turn there. She could not declare she knew because of the two tracks of thought, personal and command. Personally, she wanted to relieve their anxiety, but she also wanted to kill them. She needed time to heal, physically and emotionally, and she should take it. They were a team, and she had to let them take the lead. If this were a dance, they were leading, demanding ignorance. She would follow and provide it. As for her command, she knew well enough that accusing everyone on the ship of conspiracy and seizing control without an actual plan was irresponsible and egotistical. And she wanted to do it right now. But she had to consider and plan. Take the time to be prepared. She needed to be able to carry and fire a gun. She needed to be able to look at circumstances and come to the correct conclusions and be able to act on them immediately. She had failed in personal and command ways in the past, and she would consider them. She would not kill anybody. She would listen and watch, and she would earn her command back. She cried until she felt like throwing up with the remembered sensation of two hands holding her face. Darkness and the isolation, sheltering and familiar, comforted and devastated by the fact that her body would show no signs. Just as they wanted her to know but could not tell her, she wanted to let them know that she knew, but could not tell them that. She vowed not to kill Garrus, tried to remind herself that behind his packets of data was a man who did nothing against his nature, while millions of people potentially died each day. To preserve her best choices, if not her desired time frame. She vowed not to kill Thane, tried to remind herself that he did believe in her and would not put her at risk. And he only needed 3 chains right now. She would not fire Karen. She would not yank Edie's power source. David, I cannot for the life of me deny you a damn thing, and you're doing as you've been told by a Pawn-Eva master who is likely right. And I hate that so much I can't swallow or breathe. You've gotten a lot done from the dock, Jane. You haven't been betrayed. You've been supported. Try to be better at supporting your loved ones. Restraining yourself from killing them is not enough. It's okay to hide. It's okay to hide here. You're gonna need to hide. When you get command back, you can't ever let it go. This is it. This is the fight. You love them, and you're ready to die. They love you, and they're not ready for you to die. They have a moment in time to preserve you and your command, and they are both taking it, whatever the cost. Either way, they face losing you. Either way, you face losing them. From this moment forward, it gets harder, and a reasonable person will stare into that abyss and despair. That is what they're doing, and they have a right to it. They've earned their despair and their fears. This is the point where scary people doing their best may not ever be enough, and everyone has a right to be afraid. Especially you. Garrus. Reading through the dispatches, inevitability punched him in the gut. Reapers were attacking. Full scale, moving in through each Mass Effect relay into every system. Earth, Palaven, Thessia, Rannoch, Tuchanka, Surkesh. They'd been planning for this, anticipating this, and the scope of it still had him in denial. The Normandy was currently in an unknown backwater. They were safe here. Safe. An unbearably relative term. He bowed his head over the console and whispered, "Spirit, please." He closed his eyes, unable to say any more. Something in his bones guided him to call out to them, but something in his blood choked off the impulse. Spirits could not help him. He still felt the deep, thrumming urge to beg someone, anyone, for aid. He had felt the urge to call out to spirits when Jane had died, and his unspoken hopes had died unborn with her. He hadn't called out to them, remembering she was human, belatedly, knowing spirits had no sway over what happened to her. He knew that spirits also could not influence Reapers. His bones denied his blood, and he closed his eyes tighter. Spirits, please, watch over my family. Watch over everyone's family. His blood rushed in his ears, pounding out all the reasons why that prayer would go unheard and unanswered. Thane. Garrus had been correct. The Reaper invasion was now. Thane's fears were confined to the brightest lights of his life. He could see no further. Kolyat. Jane. Garrus. Kolyat was out of his reach, as safe as possible in the hidden ship on Hagalas. Kolyat's life, the spirit of continuity that moved through time, binding one moment to the next, had chosen its path. As a father, Thane had let go so long ago, slightly jarred each time Kolyat graced his lips with the word, "Father," that did not fit, and he did not deserve. I know now I did not love your mother, that I never gave her enough of myself to be loved in return. I did not love you. I saw the burden in you and not the grace. I created a burden of you and your mother, and you both forgave me. If there was any true magic that existed in reality, it was not Thane's ability to be invisible or his stealth. It was forgiveness. He sat in his quarters. Jane likely finished soon with her medical training for the day. She had been given no arm, no omni-tool, her patience and smiles occasionally thin and brittle, but still holding. Karen had been convinced to fit the arm later, and the omni-tool delayed, with the excuse of customization, which was true, but not the real delay. Karen had all faith that Jane would, and had, healed, miraculously so, and Miranda had confirmed. Thane had insisted upon holding the date of 4 weeks before release to command. There were now 2 weeks after her injury, 2 weeks remaining. He had pored over all relevant medical literature and research that he could find, 4 weeks being a baseline for healing. Miranda disagreed, knowing Jane's brain so well, knowing her healing rates, and all the bonuses to her metabolism that carried out the dictates of Miranda's genius. Forgive me, Miranda. I wish for my wristband to heal, for her to know that if she sends us all to die, she does it with a clear mind. Forgive me, Karen, for manipulating you into creating darkness for my Siha to rest. I cannot do your job, and I cannot allow Garrus to choose. He must have a solid horizon where he can count each step with certainty, and you must set it. Forgive me, Goliath, for not guarding you with my body as a father should. My pride in your path is such that I consider you a man, whole and complete where I am not. I still seek my pieces. I am yet a child, younger than you in too many ways to consider myself your father. Each time I hear the word father from your lips, a piece of me is not recovered, but created. Forgive me, Garrus, for urging you on a path that is like broken glass to bared feet, cold to your soul and contrary to your honesty, your loyalty, your courage. I see too many ways for you to be torn beyond my bearing. I know no way to help you walk straight, to make the lie your whole self. It is too easy for me to conceive of lying. I did not know the effort to lie to her would cause so much pain in itself. I vowed to spare you pain, and I have failed. Forgive me, Jane. You may be whole even now, greater than your parts, transcending the harm of your body. I do not wish to add insult to injury. Only allow more time for me, for all, for you to be certain that the rending of your body and the slicing open of your heart and head would give no cause for your first or last steps to be questioned. You deserve a whole mind, a whole body. May I bear the brunt of this judgment. The cold pathways of my mind see no other way. Perhaps you will find the path when your hand is restored. forgive me, Sanar Tualan, for robbing you of your name, of your family. Forgive me for the loss of your parents, who I did not guard with my body. For the death of your sister, who I did not guard with my heart. Should the worst come to pass, should my still feet allow our enemies to overtake us, grant me no forgiveness, but any grace I have earned in service, give to those I love. Thane rose to his feet, washed his face, and avoided seeing himself, avoided catching his own eye. Other than the braid of color, he left his omni-tool dark, no longer responsive to anything but his verbal key, a key unknown to Jane. He would not use it in her presence while she had none. Jane had sought multiple avenues of information. Her agile mind had discovered the restrictions to be pervasive and extensive. She had gone so far as to attempt an anonymous login from his cabin. He had hoped she would remain a patient for longer, and had not predicted fully how much effort it would take to conceal the invasion from her, or that it would leave such a wide trail. He had hoped for more time, but both her recovery and the Reaper invasion had accelerated timescales, and he was but one Drell. Some of the news organizations she had tried to access no longer existed as entities on the extranet. Many of the final filings with darkened Reaper forms in the background, screams, weapon discharges, and then nothing but static. He did not wish to exacerbate her curiosity, feared already that the attempt to conceal had caught her attention like the huntress she was, and that she would follow any scent. His only vindication was that he had bought a week for her recovery. He stood by his move, and the cost simply could not bear the consequences on his own shoulders, but sacrificed others. Whether he could buy 2 more weeks for her recovery was dependent entirely upon her huntress nature, or whether or not the Reapers found Eurydice in that time frame. He and Garrus did their best to coordinate efforts, dispatching forces under their control to the best of their tactical ability, while Jane underwent rehabilitation. Thane counseled limited communication to not draw attention to Eurydice. He gathered food for himself, food for her, and traveled to her cabin, where he found her in an interface pod. He put the food down on the table and chose to wait for her. He stepped close until he could feel her breath on the top of his head. She was taller on the raised platform, almost an altar to his mind. He moved his hand along the curves of her face without touching, counting her breath as a miracle. He would give her no cue of his presence, would not call her to leave where she was, and he would wait for her to join him, wishing her any respite she could find in her imagination. He sat and began his prayers again, his eyes straying to her between contemplation and breath. Ultimately, the draw of looking at her caught and held his attention. Here was her blank, paralyzed body, shorn of hair, shorn of purpose, vulnerable and battered. He'd grown used to her lack of arm, but right now, he had license to stare where before he'd only glanced. He remembered the woman of fire and blade, and he could not look at her without feeling that pull, like gravity, irresistible. She failed every check of vanity or grooming that he himself held. No makeup, no hair, body frankly scrawny and greatly diminished in muscle tone from her injury and trauma. It would seem a perfect time to find her unattractive, shapeless in coarse clothing as her habit. He was reassured and alarmed to find that what he had held to be theoretically true, that he would find her attractive if she had buffed the floor of the citadel as a relative drudge, was literally true. He could not unsee that light in her, and that would burn for as long as she lived. Regardless of her physical beauty, which was still present, and he could not discount, it was greatly diminished, objectively. But not subjectively. Her beauty was not what he responded to. It was not what guided him to love her. It would not diminish with age or infirmity. Reassured and warmed to know he was not in all ways shallow. Alarming to know there was no potential escape. To be truthful, he experienced jealousy that he would never manage a sense of self or dignity as she did without his physical power and beauty as shield and sword. He had always considered her mighty and righteous, and now he saw her as broken, human, and flawed, physically and emotionally, literally and metaphorically, and it drew him to her with the softer binding he'd rarely felt in her company, more akin to standing over Kolyat's tiny form when he was newborn and sleeping. Ephemeral and just as irresistible. Not the strong bond of gravity pulling, but the aching and caressing bond that made him hold still for fear of breaking it, wishing to be held in the moment. Here she did not push him back and blind him as the sun would, her body without her spirit written in each word and line of her intent. Here she was vulnerable to him, his right to be with her in her unguarded moments unquestioned, his right to watch over her as he had taken so often, standing in a corner not unlike where she stood now, cloaked and fascinated by her sleeping form. In the past, he'd been drawn irresistibly from his bed in the medbay to her. He'd resist the urge until he could no longer do so, then inform Dr. Shakwas he would go for a walk, and he would come here and watch her, her breath rising and her hair shining with a blue sheen. Spoken aloud to Garrus, but not to Jane. He owned her. Once that had been a stolen right, now it was freely granted. There was something to Drell memory and experience that transcended time or distance, something she would never have of him. With him gone, he imagined she'd have impressions, shadow puppets of thought that she could recall of him, but he would have her every day of his life and beyond if he awaited her by the shores, if he found his way to her wherever she was after death, if she found her way to him. As a human, her memory seemed to be as a flashing and ephemeral storm, whereas he could pause the maelstrom, focus on each moment, cherish each moment unchanging. I will pause the storm for us, Jane, and you will forgive me. For this is our nature, and we own each other. If you kill me in wrath, I will still belong to you, and you to me, and nothing in this life, or any life beyond, will change that. If you kill me in wrath, I will forgive you, if not help you and thank you. And I know one day you would need my forgiveness. Our binding ritual is done, and all that remains is for time to play it out. Rage and horror and love and need. It would perhaps take you weeks, or months, or years, but you will find me. For you own me, and you would no more let me go than I would let you go. Your storm will rage, and then there will be calm, and you will find me wherever I am. In this I have faith. In this you have no choice. It is your nature, as well as mine. There is no storm in me that would keep me from you. My risks are colder and harder, like the chains I would use to keep you safe, like a hand closed on a Turian throat, denying an honest man his nature. You found magic beyond forgiveness in the lines of her face, until she took her first voluntary breath and began to move, paralytic agents flushing from her system. She looked around the room, and her eyes met his, composed of cybernetic glow and the return of the blinding sun of her spirit and intellect, investing her empty body. He stared at her with the same intensity he'd applied when she was absent, and she could draw whatever conclusion she chose from that. A brief kaleidoscope of expression washed through her face. A tornado, a storm, effects of the paralytics or her thoughts. He did not know. She had every right to every expression that could be made. He could perhaps freeze them later, ponder how her facial muscles moved like a rushing river under ice. The ice melted. Her eyes warmed, and she smiled at him, gently, making her face look youthful and welcoming. She walked straight to him, gathering poise and grace seemingly from the air around her, until she embodied grace. Each element of neglect, of grooming or vanity, swept aside by the lines of her body in motion. His goddess moved to stand beside him, then moved his body for him, shifted his legs up on the couch so she could lie down on his body, her head on his shoulder. His arms moved around her gratefully, noting every incremental loss of flesh or muscle from when he'd last touched her, knowing all the physical differences that added up to ultimately nothing but data. Because her spirit was what guided her. He rested his head on top of hers, noting the growth of her hair, stubble growing long enough to have texture and movement other than bristle. He breathed in her scent, soaked in the feel of the press of her body, and fell to the gravity of Tufira, grateful for the opportunity to be lost in her. She said, music in her voice and harmonies, the chords that make her complex. I love you. Her palm on his chest, his lips in her regrowing hair, his hand cradling her head, and those words in her unreadable voice, depths and darknesses and light. There were always layers to her voice, and now they were uncounted and uncountable. He could remember this moment and replay it 1,000 times, and he still knew he would not be able to read the woman behind the words, except in occasional leaps of intuition and patterns of experience. He did not doubt her. He chose not to feel guilt, closed his arms tighter to feel her breath through him, revel in her chosen words, and allow that she meant it, would mean it, did love him, did own him. He told her, I love you. Not as layered and as direct as possible in this moment of horror and distance, yearning for simplicity and hoping to create that in this moment, that it was all that mattered. She was tired, exhausted, having earned it, now willing to show it to him. He stroked her scalp and pressed his frill to her head, spread the fingers of one hand over her back. He did not pry into her state of mind, trying to absorb it as he so often had by intuition, osmosis, observation. I was remembering what it was like to have 2 arms. Your arm will be restored soon, better than it was. And I will never use it against you. He closed his eyes, shards of raining pain, and he wondered if she knew, had discovered their lie and accepted it already. The fierce seeking for answers that had built in her collapsed. Perhaps only tiredness, perhaps grief for her limb, fresh from stepping down from its presence. Perhaps she was choosing to make her interface self limbless, and that was all. She was capable of feeling deeply for small things, or feeling however she wished about devastating things. Regardless, she loved him, and he would lose himself in that, own her, and all her choices, all her fragilities, all her strengths, all their potentials. Sleep, Siha, he said carefully, layered, a prayer to the potential of her huntress spirit. Grant me this time to watch over you. It is not long past that I saw a possible now without you, and it is not far away that we must consider it again. For now, rest and heal and stay with me. She took a deep breath. Her muscles relaxed, but her voice held a tremble of terrible comprehension and the strain of corralling herself to hold in this moment. You are my best, Tyrone. I trust you. She was rapidly fading, and he caught her last words before she slipped into sleep. For now. He thought she meant for all the nows. For now she belonged to him. She would honor now. But perhaps venom loosened her mind, and she did know. And she could not help qualifying in her way. She trusted him for now, and later she would seize her command, and the whisper of steel in her voice was a promise. He smiled. Her beauty and complications lay bare under his fingertips. For now. His prayer had been answered. He was assured, rather than dismayed, admiration of her burning in his heart. He stayed that way in the churning kaleidoscopic now of possible meaning until Garrus arrived hours later, his own food in his hands, their food forgotten. Garrus could not bear to wake her, drank in her sleeping form with his own unguarded pain and hope, shifted them slowly and with Thane's assistance so that she did not wake. Garrus gave Thane a kiss of quiet passion, stroked broad, warm fingertips over Jane's head, and claimed his rightful place. For now.